The blind horse trembled against the oak tree, helplessly tied as wolves closed in with hungry snarls and bared teeth. Victor's weathered hands gripped his walking staff as he positioned his frail body between predator and prey, his voice thundering through the frozen forest. "You will not touch my friend." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The forest fell silent as the last echoes of hooves faded into the distance. Left behind, a magnificent bay stallion stood motionless, his once proud frame now trembling slightly against the biting winter air. The rope that bound him to the ancient oak tree cut cruelly into his neck, offering just enough slack for him to shift his weight, but never to escape. His eyes, once a vibrant amber that had sparkled with life and spirit, were now clouded over with a milky film, sightless windows to a world of darkness. This was Shadow, a horse who had once carried his master with unwavering loyalty across battlefields and through royal processions. Now, he was nothing more than bait, abandoned by the son of the man who had once cherished him above all possessions, a man now 6 months in his grave. "Useless creature," Frederick had muttered earlier that day, his voice laced with contempt as he tightened the final knot. "Blind horses are nothing but a burden. The wolves will make quick work of you, and I'll be free of this obligation." Shadow had sensed the cruelty in those words, even if he couldn't see the cold indifference in Frederick's eyes. The stallion had known something was wrong the moment they'd ventured deep into the forest, far from the familiar smells of the stable and the comforting sounds of the farm. The journey had been disorienting, each step taking him further from everything he knew, guided only by the harsh tugs on his bridle. As Frederick mounted his own horse to leave, he'd paused for one final moment. "My father was a fool to keep you this long. A blind horse is worthless." With that, he'd ridden away, leaving Shadow alone with nothing but the whispering trees and the promise of wolves that would surely come with nightfall. Now, as the sun began its descent behind the ancient trees, the temperature dropped rapidly. Shadow's breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. His ears swiveled anxiously, catching every rustle of leaves, every snap of twigs in the underbrush. His nostrils flared, detecting scents that sent waves of primal fear through his powerful body. Somewhere nearby, predators were gathering, drawn by the scent of potential prey. Miles away, in a small cabin nestled at the edge of the same sprawling forest, Victor Hartman sat by his modest fire, his weathered hands carefully carving a piece of pine wood. At 72, his once dark hair had long since turned to silver, flowing down past his shoulders and joining a beard that spoke of years spent in the wilderness. Deep lines etched his face, each one a story of hardship and wisdom earned through a lifetime of solitude. Victor had not always been alone. Once, he'd been master of horse for Lord William Montgomery, overseeing the nobleman's prized stables with a dedication that bordered on reverence. For 20 years, he had cared for the magnificent creatures, training them with a gentle hand and unwavering patience. But that life had ended abruptly 15 years ago, when Victor had dared to speak against the cruel treatment of a pregnant mare by the Lord's son, Frederick. "You forget your place, stable master," Lord Montgomery had thundered, his face flushed with rage. "My son will inherit these lands and all upon them. You will accept his methods or you will leave my service." Victor's reply had been simple. "Then I shall leave, my lord." That night he had packed his few belongings and departed, but not before visiting the stables one last time to say goodbye to the horses he had loved as his own children. Among them had been a young colt named Shadow, barely 2 years old, with a spirit that burned brighter than any horse Victor had ever known. "Grow strong and true, little one," he had whispered, pressing his forehead against the colt's. "Carry your riders with honor." Now, 15 years later, Victor lived a simple life. He hunted, trapped, and occasionally ventured into the nearest village to trade furs for supplies. He spoke little, preferring the honest company of the forest to the complications of human interaction. Yet despite his solitude, Victor had never forgotten the horses he'd left behind, especially young Shadow, who had shown such extraordinary promise. On this particular evening, as Victor sat by his fire, an unsettling feeling crept over him, a sense that something was wrong in the forest he knew so intimately. He set aside his carving and stepped outside, his breath visible in the cold air. The forest was quieter than usual, the normal symphony of night creatures subdued as if holding its breath. Victor's gaze drifted toward the east, where he knew Lord Montgomery's estate lay beyond the trees. Something pulled at him, an instinct born from years of attunement to the natural world. Without fully understanding why, he reached for his heavy wool coat, pulled it over his worn flannel shirt, and grabbed his walking staff and hunting knife. No rest for old bones tonight, he muttered to himself as he set out into the darkening forest, guided only by instinct and the faint light of the rising moon. As Victor walked, memories of his time at Montgomery Estate flooded back. He remembered Lord William, stern but fair, a man who valued his horses and respected those who cared for them. Unlike his son Frederick, who had always viewed the animals as mere possessions, symbols of wealth to be displayed or discarded at whim. Victor had heard through village gossip that Lord Montgomery had passed away 6 months earlier. The estate now belonged to Frederick, and Victor could only imagine what changes the entitled young man had implemented. None for the better, he was certain. The old man's pace quickened as the feeling of urgency grew stronger. Something was calling him deeper into the forest, toward an area where the trees grew thick and ancient. As he approached a small clearing, the first howl pierced the night, a long, mournful sound that sent shivers down his spine. Wolves. Not uncommon in these woods, but something about their call tonight seemed purposeful, almost triumphant. Victor broke into a jog, his old joints protesting as he navigated the uneven forest floor. The howls continued, growing louder, joined by others until a chorus of predatory voices filled the night air. They had found prey. Pushing through a dense thicket, Victor suddenly froze. There, in a shaft of moonlight that broke through the canopy, stood a horse tied to a massive oak tree. Even from this distance, even after 15 years, Victor recognized the proud silhouette, the distinctive marking on the horse's forehead, a perfect diamond of white against dark bay. "Shadow," he whispered in disbelief. The horse's head jerked up at the sound, ears swiveling desperately toward him. And in that moment, Victor saw the clouded eyes, unseeing but alert, with terror. The magnificent warhorse that had once carried Lord Montgomery with such pride had been reduced to this, blind, abandoned, and left as a sacrifice to wolves. The rage that filled Victor was instant and all-consuming. His gaze shifted to the edge of the clearing where 2 wolves had already emerged from the underbrush, their eyes gleaming with hunger as they assessed their prey. Behind them, shadows moved, the rest of the pack waiting for the right moment to strike. Victor knew immediately what had happened. Frederick had decided a blind horse was no longer worth the cost of feed and care. Rather than give Shadow a merciful end, he had chosen this, a cruel death that would serve some twisted practical purpose. Wolf bait, to reduce the predators around his precious sheep herds. With a speed that belied his age, Victor strode into the clearing, positioning himself between Shadow and the advancing wolves. His voice, unused to shouting after years of solitude, rang out with surprising power through the frozen air. "You will not touch my friend." Victor's voice echoed through the clearing, momentarily startling the wolves. They hesitated, yellow eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence as they reassessed the situation. The lead wolf, a battle-scarred male with silver-tipped fur, took a cautious step back, head lowered but gaze fixed on the old man who had dared to challenge their hunt. Behind Victor, Shadow whinnied softly, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of a human. Not the cruel one who had abandoned him, but something familiar, something from long ago that stirred deep memories. The horse strained against his rope, his powerful muscles trembling not just with fear now, but with a desperate hope. "Easy, old friend," Victor murmured, never taking his eyes off the wolves. "I'm here now." The lead wolf growled, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the frozen ground. Another wolf appeared from the shadows to join the first two, then another, until 5 predators formed a loose semicircle, their breaths creating small clouds in the cold night air. They were hungry, and winter had made game scarce. They would not be easily deterred. Victor knew he was outnumbered and outmatched. His body, though still strong for his age, could not hope to withstand the coordinated attack of a wolf pack. Yet he stood his ground, his walking staff held horizontally before him, his hunting knife still sheathed at his belt. He would not draw the blade unless absolutely necessary. Violence had never been his first choice, even against predators who were simply following their nature. "This horse is not your prey tonight," Victor called out, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Go hunt elsewhere. There are deer in the eastern valleys, rabbits in the southern meadows. This one is under my protection." The wolves, of course, understood none of his words, but they sensed his resolve. The lead wolf took a step forward, testing Victor's courage. In response, the old man stomped his foot hard against the forest floor and shouted again, this time a wordless cry that carried all his determination. Behind him, Shadow grew more agitated, pulling harder against the rope that bound him to the tree. The rough hemp cut into his neck, drawing a thin line of blood that the wolves could surely smell. Victor knew he needed to free the horse, but turning his back on the predators would be a fatal mistake. Slowly, never breaking eye contact with the lead wolf, Victor began to move sideways toward Shadow. Each step was deliberate, his stance wide and balanced despite the uneven forest floor. Years of working with unpredictable stallions had taught him how to move with purpose while remaining ready to react. "Remember me, Shadow?" he said softly, hoping his voice might penetrate the horse's fear. "It's Victor. I taught you to accept your first saddle. I guided your first steps with a rider." Whether Shadow truly remembered or was simply responding to the calming tone, the horse's frantic movements began to subside. His ears, which had been pinned back in terror, slowly swiveled forward, focusing on Victor's voice. The wolves, meanwhile, had begun to spread out, instinctively moving to flank their prey. The strategy was as old as time. Some would distract from the front while others attacked from behind. Victor recognized the maneuver from years of observing wolf hunts from the safety of his cabin window. "Not this time," he muttered, changing direction to keep himself between the predators and Shadow. "Not this horse, not today." As if understanding the gravity of the situation, Shadow had gone completely still, his blind eyes staring sightlessly ahead, but his other senses working overtime, ears tracking every snap of twig beneath wolf paws, nostrils flaring to catch their musky scent as they circled closer. Victor's mind raced. He could not fight off the entire pack. He needed to free Shadow and somehow lead him to safety, but the horse was blind and terrified, unlikely to navigate the forest without stumbling. A stumble would mean death for both of them. He needed to change the dynamics of this confrontation. His gaze fell on a fallen branch near his feet, thick and relatively dry despite the damp forest floor. In one fluid motion, he stooped and grabbed it, never taking his eyes off the wolves. From his pocket, he withdrew the flint and small tin of tar-soaked wool he always carried for fire starting. "Hold steady, Shadow," he called, his voice providing an anchor for the frightened horse as he quickly struck the flint against his knife blade, sending sparks onto the wool. The tar caught instantly, and within seconds he had transferred the small flame to the end of the branch. The makeshift torch flared to life, casting dancing shadows across the clearing. The wolves retreated a few paces, their instinctive fear of fire temporarily overriding their hunger. Victor swung the torch in a wide arc, creating a barrier of light and heat between the predators and their intended prey. With the wolves momentarily held at bay, Victor finally risked turning to Shadow. Up close, the horse's condition broke his heart. The once gleaming coat was dull and matted, ribs visible beneath the skin. The proud muscle of his neck and shoulders had diminished, though not disappeared entirely. But it was Shadow's eyes that caused Victor's throat to tighten with emotion. Once bright and alert, they were now clouded over with the milky film of blindness. "What did they do to you, old friend?" he whispered, reaching out slowly to let the horse catch his scent. Shadow's nostrils flared, drinking in the familiar smell. Memories stirred in the depths of his animal mind. This human had meant safety once, kindness, and gentle hands that never struck in anger. A low nicker escaped his throat, a sound of recognition that nearly brought tears to Victor's eyes. "That's right," Victor said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's me. I'm going to get you out of here." Keeping the torch extended toward the wolves with one hand, Victor used the other to examine the knot that secured Shadow to the tree. It was tight and complex, clearly tied by someone who knew horses would test their restraints. Frederick had been thorough in his cruelty. Victor reached for his knife, ready to cut through the rope, when a sudden growl from behind made him spin around. One of the younger wolves, more daring or perhaps more desperate than the others, had crept closer while Victor was distracted. Now it stood barely 10 feet away, its hackles raised, jaws parted to reveal gleaming teeth. "Back!" Victor shouted, thrusting the torch toward the wolf. The animal retreated, but only slightly, and Victor could see the calculation in its eyes. The wolves were growing bolder, adapting to the presence of fire. Their hunger would soon overcome their fear. With renewed urgency, Victor turned back to Shadow's restraints. The knife made quick work of the rope, and suddenly the horse was free, though he remained standing in place, uncertain in his blindness. "Easy now," Victor murmured, placing a gentle hand on Shadow's neck, feeling the powerful muscles tense beneath his touch. "We need to move, but slowly. Trust me to be your eyes." As if understanding, Shadow lowered his head slightly, a gesture of submission that Victor remembered well from their days together at the Montgomery estate. Despite everything, despite the years of separation and whatever mistreatment had led to this moment, the horse remembered him, trusted him. A chorus of howls rose from the forest around them, more wolves answering the call of the pack that had found prey. Time was running out. "Come, old friend," Victor said, gripping Shadow's mane with one hand while keeping the torch extended with the other. "One step at a time, we walk together now, just as we once did." And with wolves closing in from all sides, man and horse began their desperate journey through the darkened forest. The forest seemed to close in around them as Victor guided Shadow away from the clearing. Every shadow harbored potential death. Every rustle of leaves might be a wolf flanking them in the darkness. The torch in Victor's hand sputtered and popped as it consumed the dry wood, its light creating a small sphere of safety that moved with them through the endless trees. "Step carefully," Victor murmured, his fingers entwined in Shadow's mane, gently guiding the blind horse over fallen logs and around treacherous dips in the forest floor. "That's it. Good boy." Shadow moved with surprising grace for a blind animal, his hooves feeling the ground before committing his weight, ears constantly swiveling to track the sounds of pursuit. Years of darkness had sharpened his other senses, and beneath the fear and confusion, Victor could sense the remarkable intelligence that had always set Shadow apart from other horses. Behind them, the wolves followed, Not charging, not yet, but moving in measured pursuit, conserving their energy for the moment when the old man's strength failed or the torch burned out. Victor could hear them, the soft pad of paws on fallen leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, low growls exchanged like tactical communications between predators who had perfected the art of the hunt over countless generations. "They're patient," Victor said to Shadow, his voice a lifeline for the horse who could not see the danger but could surely smell it. "But so are we." The journey through the nighttime forest was painfully slow. What would have taken minutes for a sighted horse and younger man stretched into an agonizing crawl. Every step had to be considered, every direction carefully chosen. Victor's muscles burned with the effort of holding the torch aloft while simultaneously guiding Shadow and watching for dangers underfoot. Despite the cold, sweat beaded on Victor's forehead, his breath came in ragged gasps that betrayed his age and the toll of the ordeal. But he pushed onward, determined that Shadow would not meet his end as wolf bait in these indifferent woods. "I should have come back for you," Victor told the horse as they navigated a particularly dense thicket. "When I heard Lord Montgomery had passed, I should have known Frederick would not honor his father's affection for you." Shadow nickered softly in response, as if absolving the old man of any guilt. Victor smiled despite their dire situation. Even now, even blind and hunted, the horse displayed the generous spirit that had made him special. A sudden chorus of howls rose behind them, closer than before. The wolves were growing bolder, or perhaps they sensed Victor's fatigue. The old man's knees trembled with exhaustion, and his arm ached from holding the torch. They needed shelter, somewhere defensible where he could rest and regroup. As if in answer to his unspoken prayer, the trees ahead began to thin, revealing the silhouette of an ancient hunter's shelter, little more than 3 stone walls and a partially collapsed roof, but solid enough to provide a corner they could defend. "There, Shadow," Victor said, relief flooding his voice. "Just a little further." But the wolves had seen it too, and understood that their prey was about to reach relative safety. The lead wolf, the battle-scarred male, suddenly darted forward, no longer content to follow at a distance. His charge was silent, deadly in its purpose, aimed directly at Shadow's exposed flank. Victor saw the movement from the corner of his eye, a darker shadow detaching from the gloom, closing the distance with frightening speed. Without hesitation, he swung the torch in a wide arc, directly into the wolf's path. The predator yelped as the flame singed its fur, veering away at the last second. But the sudden movement and noise spooked Shadow, who reared up in blind panic, nearly pulling free from Victor's grip. "Easy, easy," Victor called, fighting to maintain control of both the torch and the terrified horse. "It's all right, they won't touch you." Shadow's hooves crashed back to earth, missing Victor's foot by inches. The horse trembled violently, but remained in place, responding to the familiar voice even through his fear. Victor stroked his neck with a calming hand, all the while keeping the torch moving to ward off the circling wolves. "Almost there," he assured Shadow. "The shelter is just ahead." They resumed their careful progress, but Victor knew the wolves' attack had changed the equation. The predators had committed now. They would not simply give up and seek easier prey. The next charge might come from multiple directions at once, and Victor could not swing his torch to cover all angles. The stone shelter loomed closer, its ancient walls promising at least some protection from attack from behind. But crossing the final stretch of open ground would leave them terribly exposed. Victor made a swift decision. He shrugged out of his heavy wool coat, the cold immediately biting through his thin shirt beneath, and draped the garment over Shadow's eyes and ears. "This will help keep you calm," he murmured. "Trust me now more than ever." Then, with strength born of desperation, Victor suddenly shouted at the top of his lungs and swung the torch in wild, unpredictable patterns. The unexpected noise and movement startled the wolves, causing them to hesitate just long enough for Victor to urge Shadow into a faster pace. "Now, Shadow, run with me!" Together they covered the final distance to the shelter, Shadow stumbling once but quickly regaining his footing, guided by Victor's steady hand and unwavering voice. As they reached the stone walls, Victor positioned Shadow in the corner where two walls met, creating a defensible position with only one direction of approach. The wolves gathered at the edge of the small clearing around the shelter, their eyes reflecting the torchlight like dozens of eerie yellow stars. They paced back and forth, frustrated by the prey that had reached relative safety but unwilling to abandon the hunt entirely. Victor slumped against the stone wall beside Shadow, his aged body trembling with exhaustion. The torch was burning low, the wood nearly consumed. Soon the darkness would reclaim them and the wolves would advance again. "Need to make a fire," Victor muttered, more to himself than to Shadow. "Something that will last the night." He scanned the interior of the shelter. Previous occupants had left a small pile of firewood in one corner, dry enough to burn despite the years of neglect. There was even an old fire pit in the center, stones arranged in a circle, blackened by countless fires of hunters long gone. With shaking hands, Victor gathered what he could reach without leaving Shadow's side. He arranged the wood in the pit, adding smaller twigs and dried leaves as tinder. As the torch sputtered its final light, he transferred its dying flame to the new fire, which caught quickly and grew to push back the encroaching darkness. The wolves retreated a few paces from the strengthened light but did not leave. They would wait, Victor knew. Wait for the fire to die or for hunger to drive them to take greater risks. The standoff had merely been extended, not resolved. In the new light of the fire, Victor turned his attention to Shadow. He removed his coat from the horse's head and began to examine him properly for the first time. What he saw filled him with both anger and sorrow. Shadow's once proud body bore the marks of neglect, not outright abuse perhaps, but the slow cruelty of indifference. His ribs protruded beneath his dull coat, and old scars spoke of injuries left untreated. But worst of all were his eyes, clouded over completely, robbing him of the sight that had once made him such a magnificent riding horse. "Oh, Shadow," Victor whispered, running gentle hands over the horse's neck and shoulders. "What happened to you after I left?" Shadow leaned into Victor's touch, his blind eyes closing as if in relief at this simple kindness. And in that moment, despite the wolves waiting in the darkness, despite the bitter cold and the uncertain future, Victor made a promise to himself and to the horse who had somehow found his way back into his life. "Whatever comes next," he said softly, "we face it together." The night deepened around the small stone shelter, the temperature dropping as stars emerged in the patches of sky visible through the trees. Victor fed the fire carefully, rationing the precious wood to last until dawn. Shadow stood quietly in the corner, his breathing now steady and calm despite the occasional howls that pierced the darkness. "You always were the bravest," Victor said softly, stroking the horse's muzzle. "Even as a colt, you faced everything head-on." The flames cast flickering shadows across the weathered stone walls, momentarily transforming the humble shelter into something almost cozy. Victor allowed himself to sink down onto the cold ground, his back against the wall, legs stretched toward the fire's warmth. His body ached from the ordeal, old injuries awakening to remind him of his age. Outside, the wolves maintained their vigil. Victor could see their shapes moving at the edge of the firelight, patient, calculating, waiting for any opportunity. Occasionally, the lead wolf would approach closer than the others, testing the boundaries of their fear of fire. Each time, Victor would toss a small branch or call out sharply, sending the predator retreating back into the shadows. "They're persistent," Victor told Shadow, "but then, so are you." As the night wore on, Victor began to examine Shadow more thoroughly. his experienced hands moving gently over the horse's body. Beyond the obvious blindness and malnutrition, he found countless small injuries, a badly healed cut on the right foreleg, an old burn mark on the flank that spoke of careless handling with hot branding irons, and worst of all, signs of harness sores that indicated Shadow had been worked long after his blindness had set in. "They worked you blind," Victor muttered, anger rising in his chest. "Frederick couldn't even grant you an honorable retirement after all your years of service." Shadow nickered softly, nudging Victor's shoulder as if trying to comfort the old man despite his own suffering. The gesture nearly broke Victor's heart. "I remember when Lord Montgomery first saw you," Victor said, his voice growing distant with memory. "You were just a yearling, but you carried yourself like a king." The fire crackled as Victor's mind drifted back 15 years, to the spring auction where Shadow had first caught Lord Montgomery's eye. The colt had been spirited but not wild, intelligent but not stubborn, perfect qualities for a war horse. Lord Montgomery had paid 3 times the asking price, silencing all other bidders with a gesture that spoke of both his wealth and his appreciation for exceptional horseflesh. "He gave you to me to train," Victor continued, his hands automatically checking Shadow's hooves as he spoke. "Said he wanted his best horse trained by his best man." Shadow had taken to training like he'd been born for it. Within months, he was responding to commands that took other horses years to master. Victor had developed a special bond with the young stallion, spending extra hours after his regular duties were complete, teaching Shadow advanced maneuvers that would one day save Lord Montgomery's life in battle. "Remember the summer festival?" Victor asked, smiling at the memory. "You and Lord Montgomery won every event. Frederick was so jealous he couldn't even look at you for weeks afterward." Frederick had always resented his father's affection for Shadow, while Lord Montgomery saw a noble partner worthy of respect. Frederick saw only a tool, a possession to be used and discarded. He had his own horse, a flashy chestnut with more beauty than brains, but it never achieved the connection with Frederick that Shadow had with Lord Montgomery. "That's why he left you for the wolves," Victor said, his voice hardening. "Not just because you're blind, but because you were his father's favorite. His final act of rebellion against a man he could never measure up to." Shadow's ears twitched at the tone in Victor's voice, and the old man made an effort to calm himself. His anger would serve no purpose here, not when Shadow needed his steady presence and clear thinking. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and Victor added the last of the larger branches. Dawn was still hours away, and the wolves showed no signs of abandoning their vigil. If anything, they had grown more numerous. Victor counted at least 8 different pairs of eyes reflecting the firelight now. "We need a plan for morning," Victor told Shadow, keeping his voice low and soothing despite the gravity of their situation. "My cabin is too far, we'd never make it. The village is closer, but still a hard journey for a blind horse and an old man." He considered their options, none of them good. Staying put would only delay the inevitable. Once the firewood ran out completely, the wolves would attack. Attempting to reach the village meant crossing several miles of dense forest with predators at their heels, and returning to Montgomery Estate seemed impossible. Frederick would simply finish what he had started, yet as Victor pondered their limited choices, an idea began to form. There was one place, not too far from their current position, that might offer temporary sanctuary, an abandoned woodcutter's cottage he had discovered during his solitary explorations of the forest. It was small, but sturdy, with 4 walls and a door that could be barred against predators. "I know where we can go," Victor said, his voice strengthening with renewed purpose. "Somewhere safe to rest properly and figure out our next move." Shadow seemed to sense the change in Victor's demeanor, his ears perking forward attentively. "But first, we need to get through the night," Victor added, looking regretfully at their dwindling firewood. With careful movements, Victor removed his shirt despite the cold, tearing it into strips that he wound around green branches he'd gathered earlier. These makeshift torches wouldn't burn as brightly or as long as proper ones, but they might provide enough protection to keep the wolves at bay until morning. As he worked, Victor continued talking to Shadow, the sound of his voice a constant reassurance in the horse's world of darkness. "You know, after I left Montgomery Estate, I thought about you often," he admitted. "Wondered how you were faring, if you remembered me at all." Shadow stood quietly, his head lowered slightly as if listening intently to every word. "I even came back once, about 5 years ago," Victor continued. "Watched from the hills as you carried Lord Montgomery on a hunt. You were magnificent, at the peak of your strength." The memory brought a smile to Victor's weathered face. Shadow had indeed been a sight to behold that day, moving with such power and grace that even from a distance Victor had felt pride swell in his chest. The horse he had trained had become everything he'd hoped for. "I never imagined I'd see you again like this," Victor said softly, reaching up to stroke Shadow's neck. "Blind and abandoned. But perhaps it was fate that brought me to the forest tonight. Perhaps we were meant to find each other again." Outside, the lead wolf let out a long, mournful howl that was quickly joined by others, the sound rising through the trees like a chilling chorus. Shadow's muscles tensed beneath Victor's hand, but the horse remained steady, drawing strength from the old man's presence. "Dawn will come," Victor promised, as much to himself as to Shadow. "And when it does, we'll make our move, together." As if understanding, Shadow gently lowered his head to nuzzle Victor's shoulder, a gesture of trust that transcended the barrier of species and the years of separation. In that moment, despite the cold, despite the hungry wolves, despite the uncertainty of their future, Victor felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the dying fire. They had found each other again, and somehow that made all the difference. The first hint of dawn came as a subtle lightening of the sky visible through the trees. Victor, who had dozed fitfully throughout the night, stirred at the changing quality of the darkness. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, just a few glowing embers that cast barely enough light to see Shadow's outline against the stone wall. The wolves were still there. Though Victor couldn't see them clearly in the pre-dawn gloom, he could sense their presence, a patient hunger that had not diminished with the passing hours. If anything, their determination had grown stronger as their prey remained tantalizingly out of reach. "Morning comes, old friend," Victor whispered to Shadow, his voice rough from the cold night air. "Time to prepare ourselves." Shadow's ears swiveled toward the sound of Victor's voice, and the horse shifted his weight slightly, ready for whatever would come next. Despite the night spent standing in the cramped shelter, Shadow seemed alert and steady, drawing on reserves of strength that spoke of his noble bloodline. Victor rose stiffly, his joints protesting after hours on the cold ground. Age had not been kind to his body, especially during the harsh winter months when old injuries ached like perpetual reminders of a harder life. But there was no time for self-pity now. They needed to move while they still had the strength. With methodical care, Victor prepared the makeshift torches he had crafted during the night. He used the last embers of their fire to light one, watching as the flame caught on the strips of his torn shirt, creating a wavering light that pushed back against the shadows. "The woodcutter's cottage is about 2 miles east of here," Victor told Shadow as he worked. "Not an easy journey, especially for you, but it's our best chance." Shadow nickered softly as if in agreement. Victor had always marveled at the horse's intelligence, his seeming ability to understand human speech beyond the normal capacity of his kind. That intelligence shone through even now, despite the blindness that had claimed his sight. As dawn broke fully over the forest, Victor could finally see the wolves clearly. They had settled in a loose semicircle around the open side of the shelter, some lying down, others pacing restlessly. The lead wolf, recognizable by his battle-scarred face, sat slightly apart from the others, his amber eyes fixed unwaveringly on Victor and Shadow. "They've invested too much now to simply give up," Victor murmured. "They'll follow us the whole way." The realization settled heavily on his shoulders. 2 miles might as well be 20, when every step would be dogged by predators waiting for the first sign of weakness. Yet there was no alternative. Staying meant certain death once the torches burned out. Victor used the remaining time to examine Shadow once more, this time focusing on understanding how the horse had come to be blind. Up close in the growing light, he could see that the milky film over Shadow's eyes wasn't the cloudy cataracts of old age, but something different, a uniform whiteness that suggested injury rather than disease. "What happened to you?" Victor asked softly, gently touching the area around Shadow's eyes. The horse flinched slightly at the touch, and Victor immediately withdrew his hand. Whatever had caused the blindness had been traumatic. That much was clear. Another crime to lay at Frederick's feet, Victor thought bitterly. As the forest brightened with morning light, Victor made his final preparations. He fashioned a simple halter from the remains of the rope that had bound Shadow to the tree, carefully avoiding the raw spot on the horse's neck. Then he gathered the makeshift torches, securing all but one inside his belt. "It's time, Shadow," he said, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. "Stay close to me. Feel the ground before you commit your weight. Trust my voice to guide you." With torch held high in one hand and the other gripping Shadow's makeshift halter, Victor stepped out of the shelter into the clearing. The wolves immediately rose to their feet, alert and ready, but maintaining their distance from the flame. "Back!" Victor shouted, swinging the torch in a wide arc. "Back, I say." The wolves retreated a few paces, but quickly regrouped, falling into a loose formation that would allow them to follow while remaining just beyond the reach of the fire. They would not be so easily discouraged. Victor set a course eastward, where he knew the woodcutter's cottage waited. The going was painfully slow, each step carefully measured to ensure Shadow could navigate the uneven forest floor. The horse moved with remarkable precision for a blind animal, his hooves feeling the ground with each stride, ears constantly swiveling to track both Victor's movements and the sounds of the following wolves. "That's it," Victor encouraged, his voice a constant presence guiding Shadow through the darkness that had become his world. "A fallen log ahead. Lift your front hooves higher. Good boy." They settled into a rhythm of sorts, man and horse moving as one through the dappled morning light of the forest. Behind them, the wolves followed like shadows, sometimes drawing closer when the terrain forced Victor and Shadow to slow, then retreating when Victor turned to brandish the torch. As they walked, Victor's mind drifted back to the day he had left Montgomery Estate. He remembered the bitter argument with Lord Montgomery, the harsh words exchanged, and the sense of profound loss as he walked away from the horses he had cared for most of his adult life. "I should have taken you with me then," Victor told Shadow. "But I thought you would have a good life with Lord Montgomery. He loved you, in his way." Shadow's ear flicked back to catch Victor's words, his head bobbing slightly as if in understanding. Perhaps he too remembered that day, the sudden absence of the man who had been his first trainer and friend. They had covered perhaps half a mile when Victor's torch began to sputter, the improvised fuel burning faster than he had anticipated. He quickly lit another from the dying flame, but the brief moment of vulnerability didn't go unnoticed by the wolves. The lead wolf darted forward, testing their defenses, only to retreat when the new torch flared to life. "They're getting bolder," Victor muttered. "We need to pick up our pace." But increasing their speed was easier said than done. The forest floor was treacherous with hidden roots and sudden dips that could easily cause a blind horse to stumble. One fall could be catastrophic. Shadow might break a leg, or Victor might lose his grip on the torch. Either scenario would mean a swift end at the jaws of the waiting wolves. Yet despite the dangers, They pressed on. Victor's voice remained steady, guiding Shadow around obstacles and warning him of difficult terrain ahead. The horse responded with remarkable trust, placing his faith entirely in the old man who had returned to his life so unexpectedly. "There was a time when you carried me," Victor said, his breath coming harder as they navigated a slight incline. "Now I lead you. Life has its ironies, doesn't it?" Shadow snorted, as if agreeing with the observation. Victor smiled despite their dire situation. Even now, even blind and hunted, Shadow maintained the dignity and intelligence that had always set him apart. The sun climbed higher, warming the winter forest and casting long shadows through the trees. They had been traveling for nearly 2 hours, their progress agonizingly slow but steady. Victor estimated they had covered just over a mile, halfway to their destination. His legs trembled with fatigue, and his throat was parched from constant talking. But he pushed on, drawing strength from Shadow's unwavering trust. "Not much further now," he assured the horse, though the words were as much for himself as for Shadow. "Just a little longer and we'll have walls around us again. Safety." Behind them, the wolf pack continued their patient pursuit, waiting for the moment when determination would falter, when strength would fail, when prey would become meat. Midday approached, bringing with it a deceptive warmth that did little to ease Victor's growing exhaustion. His third torch was burning dangerously low, the flame shrinking as the makeshift fuel was consumed. Behind them, the wolves had grown more strategic in their pursuit, no longer following in a pack but spreading out among the trees, some moving ahead to flank the slow-moving pair. "They're trying to cut us off," Victor murmured to Shadow, his eyes tracking the gray shapes that darted between distant trunks. "Getting smarter about their hunting." Shadow's ears pivoted constantly, tracking sounds that even Victor's experienced woodsman's senses couldn't detect. The horse was tiring, his steps becoming less certain, his once proud head hanging lower with each passing hour. Yet he continued forward, placing complete trust in Victor's guidance. As they navigated a particularly dense thicket, Victor's foot caught on a hidden root, sending him stumbling forward. He managed to keep his balance, but in the moment of distraction, his grip on Shadow's makeshift halter slipped. The horse, suddenly without his guide, froze in place, blind eyes wide with renewed fear. "Shadow!" Victor called, quickly regaining his footing and reaching for the horse. "I'm here. I'm still here." But the momentary separation had been enough to alert the wolves to a potential weakness. 2 of them immediately darted closer, approaching Shadow from opposite sides. Victor lunged forward, swinging the torch wildly to drive them back, but his sudden movement and the predator's proximity caused Shadow to rear up in panic, his front hooves pawing at the air. "Easy, easy!" Victor shouted, desperately trying to calm the horse while keeping the wolves at bay. "I won't leave you, I promise." Shadow came down heavily, nearly trampling Victor in his blind fear. The old man dodged at the last second, feeling the rush of air as massive hooves crashed to earth beside him. In the chaos, Victor's torch struck a tree trunk, sending a shower of sparks into the dry underbrush. A small flame caught immediately, spreading rapidly through the fallen leaves. For a moment, all parties, man, horse, and wolves, froze, watching as the fire grew with alarming speed. Then Victor acted, grabbing Shadow's halter and pulling him away from the spreading flames. "This way," he urged, leading the horse through a gap in the undergrowth. "The fire will hold them back, but not for long." The forest fire, though small, created a momentary barrier between them and the wolf pack. Victor used the precious advantage to increase their pace, guiding Shadow with renewed urgency. The woodcutter's cottage couldn't be far now, perhaps half a mile at most, if they could reach it before the wolves circled around the fire. As they moved faster through the trees, Victor found himself talking continuously to Shadow, not just to guide him, but to keep both their spirits up. "Did I ever tell you about the day Lord Montgomery first rode you?" he asked, his voice strained but determined. "You were barely 3 years old, still green, but he insisted, said he could feel your potential." Shadow's ears flicked back and forth, catching Victor's words even as he navigated the difficult terrain. "Everyone thought you'd throw him. That powerful young stallion no one else could handle. But I knew better." Victor smiled at the memory, despite their dire situation. "You carried him like you'd been doing it all your life. So smooth, so responsive." The look on Frederick's face was priceless. They pushed on, the sounds of the forest fire fading behind them. Victor knew the wolves would not be deterred for long. They would simply circle around the flames and resume their pursuit, perhaps with even greater determination after being cheated of their prey. "We're close now," Victor assured Shadow, though in truth, he was becoming disoriented. The forest here was less familiar than he'd remembered, the landmarks altered by years of growth and seasonal changes. Had he miscalculated their direction? Was the cottage farther than he thought? A distant howl confirmed his fears. The wolves had already circumvented the fire and were once again on their trail. Victor's body screamed for rest, his old bones aching with each step, but he forced himself to continue. Stopping now meant death for both of them. As they crested a small rise, Victor suddenly caught sight of a structure through the trees, the weathered gray wood of the abandoned woodcutter's cottage, its roof partially collapsed, but its walls still standing strong. Relief flooded through him so intensely that his knees nearly buckled. "There it is, Shadow," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Safety!" But their path to sanctuary was not clear. Between them and the cottage lay a small clearing, open ground that would leave them exposed during the final approach. And at the edge of that clearing, as if sensing their intentions, waited the lead wolf, his scarred face turned toward them with terrible intelligence in his amber eyes. Victor hesitated, weighing their options. The torch in his hand was nearly spent, and he had only one remaining. Making a dash across the clearing might provoke an immediate attack, but lingering in the trees would only allow more of the pack to arrive. "We have no choice," he told Shadow, gripping the halter firmly. "We run for it. Together." Drawing a deep breath, Victor lit his final torch from the dying flame of the current one. Then with a silent prayer, he led Shadow out of the trees and into the clearing, moving as quickly as the blind horse could safely manage. The lead wolf saw them immediately. He rose to his feet, hackles raised, a low growl emanating from deep in his chest. Behind him, more wolves emerged from the trees, forming a line between Victor, Shadow, and their destination. "Back!" Victor shouted, waving the torch before him. "You will not have him today." The wolves hesitated, their instinctive fear of fire warring with their hunger and the promise of such substantial prey. The lead wolf took a step forward, testing Victor's resolve, then another. In that moment, with predators before them and more surely closing in behind, Victor made a decision born of desperation and deep affection. He released Shadow's halter and stepped forward alone, placing himself squarely between the horse and the advancing wolves. "Shadow, stay," he commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority that had once made him master of horse at Montgomery Estate. "Trust me." Then, brandishing the torch with one hand and his hunting knife with the other, Victor advanced toward the wolf pack. His aged body straightened, drawing on reserves of strength he hadn't known he still possessed. His voice, when it came, rang out across the clearing with surprising power. "I am Victor Hartman. I have lived in these woods for 15 years. I have respected your territory and your right to hunt, but this horse is under my protection. He is not your prey." The lead wolf paused, seemingly startled by the old man's sudden aggression. Behind Victor, Shadow remained motionless, blind eyes fixed forward as if he could see the confrontation unfolding before him. "You want flesh?" Victor continued, advancing another step. "Then take mine first. But know this, I will not fall easily, and neither will he. The wolves spread out, instinctively preparing to flank their prey. Victor turned slowly in place, keeping the torch moving, refusing to show weakness or fear despite the hammering of his heart. In this standoff between man and nature, between civilization and wilderness, Victor stood as Shadow's only hope, a frail human barrier against primal hunger. And somehow, in this moment of utmost danger, he felt more alive than he had in years. Time seemed to slow in the clearing, each second stretching into eternity as Victor faced the wolf pack. The torch in his hand sputtered, its flame growing weaker with each passing moment, a visible countdown to when their fragile advantage would disappear. Behind him, Shadow remained perfectly still, as if understanding that the slightest movement might trigger the predator's attack instinct. The lead wolf took another cautious step forward, his scarred muzzle wrinkling to reveal yellowed fangs. Victor responded by lunging forward suddenly, shouting and swinging the torch in a wide arc that sent the wolf retreating a few paces. "Not today!" Victor roared, his voice cracking with the effort. "Not him, not ever!" But for every step the lead wolf took backward, others in the pack moved to the sides, gradually encircling Victor and Shadow. The strategy was clear: contain the prey, wait for weakness, then strike from all directions at once. It was hunting behavior as old as time itself, perfected over countless generations. Victor's mind raced, seeking any advantage in their desperate situation. The cottage was tantalizingly close, perhaps 50 yards across the clearing, but it might as well have been 50 miles with wolves blocking their path. His aging body was reaching its limits, muscles trembling from exhaustion and cold. The torch would not last much longer. In that moment of near despair, Victor's gaze fell upon a fallen branch near his foot, thick and heavy, almost as long as a man's arm. Not a weapon exactly, but something more substantial than the knife he carried. Without taking his eyes off the wolves, he slowly bent down and grasped it, feeling its reassuring weight in his hand. "Remember the summer storm, Shadow?" Victor called out, wanting the horse to focus on his voice rather than the surrounding danger. "The one that struck during Lord Montgomery's 50th birthday celebration." Shadow's ears pricked forward. Whether at the memory or simply at Victor's voice, it was impossible to know. Victor continued speaking as he adjusted his grip on both torch and branch, preparing for what must come next. Lightning hit the stable roof. Every horse panicked, except you. You stood calm while I evacuated the others. Victor's voice grew stronger with the memory. "Lord Montgomery said that day that you had the heart of a warrior and the soul of a philosopher." The lead wolf growled, perhaps sensing that Victor was gathering his resolve. The other wolves responded, a chorus of low rumbles that seemed to vibrate through the frozen ground. They were done waiting. "We're going to make a run for it, Shadow," Victor said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that only the horse could hear. "When I shout, come to my voice. Trust me one last time." Then, summoning strength he didn't know he still possessed, Victor suddenly charged directly at the lead wolf, brandishing torch and branch, a battle cry tearing from his throat. The unexpected aggression caught the wolf off guard, causing him to leap backward in surprise. The other wolves hesitated, momentarily confused by prey that had suddenly become predator. In that crucial moment of uncertainty, Victor pivoted and ran toward the cottage, shouting over his shoulder, "Shadow, to me, now!" Behind him, he heard the thunder of hooves as Shadow responded to his call, galloping forward despite his blindness, guided by Victor's voice and the instinct that had always made him exceptional. The wolves, recovering from their surprise, launched into pursuit, but the sudden movement of horse and man had disrupted their careful positioning. Victor ran as he hadn't run in 20 years, his aged legs somehow finding the strength to carry him across the uneven ground toward the cottage. Shadow followed, his hoofbeats drawing closer, trusting completely in Victor's guidance despite the terror of galloping blind. "Left, Shadow. Veer left," Victor called as he sensed the horse was drifting off course. Miraculously, Shadow adjusted his trajectory, his massive form now pulling alongside Victor. The wolves gave chase, but the sudden burst of speed had given man and horse a critical head start. The cottage loomed closer, its weathered door hanging partially open on rusted hinges. Victor pushed himself harder, lungs burning, legs aching, the wolves gaining with each passing second. Shadow kept pace, his blind trust in Victor allowing him to gallop across terrain he could not see. "Almost there," Victor gasped. "Straight ahead." As they reached the cottage, Victor flung the dying torch at the nearest wolf, buying precious seconds. He grabbed Shadow's halter and guided the horse through the doorway, which was thankfully wide enough to admit the large animal. As soon as they were inside, Victor spun around and threw his weight against the door, forcing it closed just as the lead wolf slammed against it from the outside. The impact nearly knocked Victor off his feet, but he held firm, fumbling for the iron bar that would secure the door. His fingers found it, rusted but intact, and with a tremendous effort, he dropped it into place across the door. Not a moment too soon. The door shuddered as wolves hurled themselves against it, snarling in frustration at being denied their prey. But the old woodcutter had built well. The thick oak door held firm against the assault. Victor slumped to the floor, his back against the door, breath coming in ragged gasps. Shadow stood in the center of the single room, sides heaving, foam flecking his muzzle from the exertion of their desperate run. But they were alive. They were safe, at least for now. As his breathing steadied, Victor took stock of their sanctuary. The cottage was small but sturdy, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and little else. Years of abandonment had left a thick layer of dust on every surface, but the roof, though sagging in places, appeared to be intact enough to provide shelter. Most importantly, the walls were solid, with only a small window too narrow for a wolf to enter. "We made it, old friend," Victor said, his voice hoarse from shouting. "We made it." Shadow turned toward the sound of Victor's voice, nickering softly as if in agreement. The horse took a tentative step forward, then another, carefully navigating the unfamiliar space until he stood before Victor. With gentle movements, he lowered his head until his muzzle rested against Victor's shoulder, a gesture of such trust and affection that tears sprang to the old man's eyes. "I know," Victor whispered, reaching up to stroke Shadow's velvet nose. "I know." Outside, the wolves continued their assault on the door, but their efforts seemed more perfunctory now, as if they understood that their prey had escaped. Eventually, they would disperse to seek easier targets, though Victor suspected the lead wolf might maintain his vigil longer than the others. Such was the nature of an alpha predator: persistence beyond reason, pride beyond hunger. As the immediate danger passed, exhaustion claimed Victor completely. His body, pushed beyond its limits, demanded rest. But before he could allow himself to sleep, he needed to ensure Shadow's comfort. With trembling hands, he removed the makeshift halter, gently massaging the raw spots where the rope had chafed the horse's skin. "We're safe for now," he told Shadow. "Rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Shadow seemed to understand, lowering himself carefully to the dusty floor in a rare position of vulnerability. Horses seldom lay down except in places they feel completely secure, and the sight of the proud stallion allowing himself this comfort touched Victor deeply. Moving stiffly, Victor gathered what he could find in the abandoned cottage: an old blanket, musty but serviceable, and some kindling left by the previous occupant. He started a small fire in the fireplace, the warmth gradually pushing back against the chill that had settled into his bones. Then, finally allowing his guard to lower, Victor settled beside Shadow, leaning against the horse's warm flank. Together, they had survived the impossible: a blind horse and an old man against a pack of hungry wolves. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. Victor awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings. Sunlight filtered through the cottage's single window, casting golden rectangles across the dusty floor. Beside him, Shadow still slept, his massive chest rising and falling with each deep breath. The events of the previous day came rushing back, the desperate flight through the forest, the confrontation with the wolves, their narrow escape to this abandoned shelter. "We survived the night, old friend," Victor murmured, his voice rough with sleep. At the sound, Shadow's ears twitched and the horse lifted his head, blind eyes searching for Victor in the darkness that was his constant world. Victor rose stiffly, his aged body protesting after a night spent on the hard floor. Every muscle ached, every joint screamed with pain. He was too old for such adventures, too worn by life to be running from wolves and sleeping on cottage floors. Yet here he was, alive against all odds, with a blind horse who had once been the pride of Montgomery Estate. Moving to the window, Victor peered outside. The clearing appeared empty, no sign of the wolf pack that had pursued them so relentlessly, but Victor knew better than to assume they had gone completely. Wolves were patient hunters, capable of waiting days for the right opportunity. The lead wolf, at least, might still be watching from the cover of the trees. "We have a reprieve, but not freedom," he told Shadow, who had managed to get to his feet and was now standing patiently, awaiting guidance in this unfamiliar space. Victor turned his attention to their immediate needs. The cottage, abandoned for years, offered little in terms of supplies, but the previous occupant had left some basic items: an iron pot, some tattered blankets, an axe with a cracked handle leaning in the corner. Most importantly, there was a small root cellar beneath a trapdoor in the floor, where Victor discovered several preserved food items that remained remarkably intact. Jars of pickled vegetables, dried meat wrapped in oilcloth, even a sack of oats that, while stale, would provide much-needed nourishment for Shadow. "Breakfast, my friend," Victor said, pouring some of the oats into the upturned lid of a barrel that would serve as a makeshift feeding trough. Shadow found his way to the food with remarkable precision, guided by scent and the sound of Victor's voice. As Shadow ate, Victor assessed their situation with the clear-headed pragmatism of a man who had survived alone in the wilderness for 15 years. They had shelter and some food, but both were temporary advantages. The cottage, while secure against wolves, was too small to comfortably house a full-grown horse for long. The food would last perhaps 3 days if carefully rationed, and winter was deepening, the brief warmth of yesterday's sun already giving way to colder temperatures that would make travel increasingly difficult. They had 3 options as Victor saw it: attempt to reach his cabin, a journey of at least 2 days through wolf-infested forest; try for the nearest village, where Shadow might find a new home, but Victor would need to confront human society after years of solitude, or return to Montgomery Estate to confront Frederick about his cruelty to Shadow. None were ideal. All carried significant risks. As if sensing Victor's troubled thoughts, Shadow finished his meal and made his way carefully across the cottage floor to where the old man sat. With gentle movements that belied his size, the horse lowered his head to nuzzle Victor's shoulder. "What would you choose if you could?" Victor asked, stroking the horse's muzzle. "Return to the life you knew even with Frederick's cruelty, or start anew somewhere else, with people who might care for you properly?" Shadow offered no answer beyond the steady rhythm of his breathing, but the question hung in the air, demanding consideration. The bond between them, rekindled after 15 years of separation, complicated matters further. Victor had lived alone for so long, finding peace in solitude. Could he simply walk away from Shadow again, entrusting him to others? Or was their reunion meant for something more permanent? Victor rose and moved to the cottage door, listening carefully before lifting the iron bar and opening it just enough to peer outside. The day was clear but cold, the sun providing light without warmth. No wolves visible, but the forest beyond the clearing held countless places for them to hide, to watch, to wait. "We can't stay here indefinitely," Victor said, closing the door and replacing the bar. "Sooner or later, we must make a choice." As if in response, Shadow pawed at the floor with one hoof, an action that startled Victor with its deliberateness. The horse repeated the gesture, more insistently this time. "What is it?" Victor asked, moving closer. Shadow continued pawing at the same spot, and curiosity compelled Victor to investigate. Kneeling, he brushed away decades of accumulated dust from the wooden floorboards. Beneath the grime, something caught his eye, markings carved into the wood, almost invisible with age but still discernible to careful fingers. "Initials," Victor murmured, tracing the faded letters. "WM and a date. 30 years ago. WM. William Montgomery." Victor sat back on his heels, mind racing. Lord Montgomery had owned these woods for decades before his death. Had this cottage once belonged to him? Had he carved his initials here as a young man, perhaps during hunting trips or solitary rides through his lands? "Did you know Shadow?" Victor asked, looking up at the horse who stood patiently above him. "Did you somehow sense his presence here?" Shadow nickered softly, a sound that might have meant anything or nothing. But the discovery changed something in Victor's thinking. If this cottage had once been Lord Montgomery's retreat, then they were on Montgomery land, closer to the estate than Victor had realized, and that proximity offered both danger and opportunity. Rising to his feet, Victor moved about the cottage with renewed purpose, examining every corner, every abandoned item with fresh eyes. In a small trunk beneath the window, covered with a moldering blanket, he discovered more evidence of the cottage's former owner: a silver flask engraved with the Montgomery crest, a hunting journal with William's distinctive handwriting, and most significantly, a detailed map of the estate and surrounding forests. "This changes things," Victor told Shadow, spreading the brittle map on the rough-hewn table. "If we're here," he pointed to a mark on the map labeled Hunter's Rest, "then the estate is less than 5 miles to the northeast. A hard journey, but possible, even for a blind horse if we're careful." The discovery solidified Victor's resolve. Frederick's cruelty to Shadow, abandoning a faithful servant to die a horrible death, could not go unchallenged. Lord Montgomery had been a fair man, respected by those who worked for him. His son's dishonorable actions dishonored his memory as much as they hurt Shadow. "We're going back," Victor decided, folding the map carefully and tucking it inside his shirt. "Back to where this all began. Frederick must answer for what he's done." Shadow stood motionless, blind eyes fixed on nothing, yet his posture conveyed an alertness that suggested he understood the gravity of Victor's words. The horse who had carried Lord Montgomery into battle, who had been the pride of his stables, would return to confront the son who had betrayed that legacy. "It won't be easy," Victor continued, gathering what supplies he could find and fashioning them into bundles that could be carried. "The wolves will still be hunting. The forest will not be kind. But we go together, as we should have been all along." Outside, the winter sun began its early descent toward the horizon. They would rest another night in the relative safety of the cottage, regaining strength for the journey ahead. And tomorrow they would begin the final chapter of their unlikely reunion. A blind war horse and an aging stablemaster, bound by loyalty and affection, returning to face the man who had nearly destroyed them both. Dawn broke cold and clear over the forest, painting the treetops with pale golden light that did little to dispel the winter chill. Victor stood in the doorway of the cottage, surveying the clearing for any sign of the wolf pack. Nothing moved among the trees, but he knew better than to assume they had given up the hunt entirely. "They're still out there," he told Shadow, who stood saddled with improvised gear fashioned from blankets and rope. watching, waiting, but we can't delay any longer. During the night, Victor had prepared as best he could for their journey to Montgomery Estate. He had fashioned a crude halter and reins from rope found in the cottage, padded with strips of blanket to protect Shadow's raw skin. A makeshift saddlebag contained their meager provisions: dried meat, the remainder of the oats, and a small jar of preserved berries that would have to sustain them. Most importantly, he had created a sturdy walking staff with the axe handle, its end wrapped in oil-soaked rags that could be quickly lit into a torch if wolves approached. 5 miles northeast, Victor murmured, orienting himself using the sun and the worn map he'd discovered. Through the north woods and across Falconer's Creek. Then we'll see the estate walls. With a deep breath, he led Shadow from the cottage into the clearing, every sense alert for danger. The horse moved with surprising confidence despite his blindness, head held high, ears swiveling to catch every sound. Together they set a course northeast, leaving behind the temporary sanctuary that had sheltered them through the night. The morning passed in tense vigilance as they made their way through the dense forest. Victor maintained a constant dialogue with Shadow, partly to guide the blind horse over difficult terrain, partly to mask his own growing apprehension. Lord Montgomery named these the North Woods when he was just a boy, Victor explained as they navigated a particularly thick stretch of underbrush. The story goes that he got lost here for 3 days when he was 12. His father organized a massive search. The entire estate turned out to find him. Shadow's ears flicked back and forth, following Victor's voice while simultaneously tracking the forest sounds around them. When they finally found him, he wasn't frightened at all. Said he'd made friends with a fox who showed him where to find berries and how to make a shelter from pine branches. Victor smiled at the memory. Lord Montgomery always had a way with animals. Like you and him. A perfect match from the first moment. As midday approached, they reached Falconer's Creek, normally a gentle stream but now swollen with winter melt, its waters rushing cold and fast between snow-dusted banks. Victor frowned, studying the obstacle. The usual crossing stones would be submerged and the current looked treacherous. "We'll need to find another way across," he told Shadow, leading the horse upstream in search of a narrower section. They had traveled perhaps half a mile when Victor spotted a fallen tree spanning the creek, an old oak that had finally surrendered to time and weather, creating a natural bridge some 2 feet wide. For a man alone, it would be an easy crossing. For a blind horse, it presented a formidable challenge. "I don't know if we can do this," Victor admitted, studying the log bridge with concern. "It's solid enough to hold your weight, but one misstep and you'd fall into the creek." Shadow snorted softly, as if expressing impatience with the delay. Victor looked at the horse with newfound appreciation. Despite everything, Shadow retained the courage that had made him such an exceptional mount. Perhaps, with proper guidance, they could manage the crossing. "All right," Victor decided, "but we do this my way, slow and steady." With painstaking care, Victor led Shadow onto the fallen tree, speaking constantly to reassure and guide the blind horse. "Straight ahead. Feel with your right foreleg before placing your weight. That's it. One step at a time." Shadow moved with remarkable precision, placing each hoof with careful deliberation, guided by Victor's voice and the pressure of the reins. Halfway across, a sudden gust of wind shook the surrounding trees, sending a shower of snow down around them. Shadow froze, momentarily startled. "Steady," Victor soothed. "Just the wind. You're doing perfectly." Step by careful step, they continued across the makeshift bridge until finally reaching the opposite bank. Victor released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You never cease to amaze me, old friend." Their triumph was short-lived. As they moved away from the creek, Victor caught sight of movement among the trees ahead, the unmistakable gray shape of a wolf slipping between trunks. The pack had not abandoned the hunt but had circled ahead, anticipating their course. They know where we're going, Victor realized aloud. They're trying to cut us off before we reach the estate. The discovery lent new urgency to their journey. Victor increased their pace as much as Shadow's blindness would allow, constantly scanning the forest for signs of the predators. Occasionally he caught glimpses, a shadow moving parallel to their path, the flash of eyes watching from distant underbrush. The wolves were pacing them, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. As the afternoon waned, the forest began to thin, a sign they were approaching the cultivated lands of Montgomery Estate. Victor's heart quickened with both hope and apprehension. Soon they would leave the relative cover of the trees for the exposed fields that surrounded the estate proper. A dangerous transition with wolves tracking them, but necessary to reach their destination. "We're close now," Victor told Shadow, his voice dropping instinctively, as if the estate might hear him. "Another mile at most." The sun hung low in the western sky when they finally emerged from the forest edge onto the vast expanse of winter-dormant fields that surrounded Montgomery Estate. In the distance, Victor could see the gray stone walls of the main house rising against the darkening sky, smoke curling from multiple chimneys. Closer, the stables and outbuildings formed a familiar silhouette that tugged at memories long suppressed. "There it is," Victor said softly. "Your home for so many years." Shadow's reaction was immediate and profound. His head lifted, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of the estate, hay and horses, smoke and humanity. A soft nicker escaped him, a sound so full of recognition and longing that it brought unexpected tears to Victor's eyes. "You remember," he whispered, stroking the horse's neck. "Of course you do." They stood at the forest edge for a long moment, man and horse both contemplating the significance of what lay before them. For Shadow, it was a return to familiar ground after a cruel betrayal. For Victor, it meant confronting a past he had walked away from 15 years ago, and the man who had inherited Lord Montgomery's title but none of his honor. The moment of reflection was shattered by a chilling sound, a wolf's howl, much closer than before. Victor spun around to see the pack emerging from the trees behind them, no longer hiding their presence. The lead wolf stood at the forefront, scarred face fixed on them with terrible purpose. "They've been waiting for this," Victor realized, "for us to be caught in the open." The wolves began to spread out in a wide semicircle, cutting off any retreat back to the forest. Ahead lay the estate fields, open ground that would leave them completely exposed during the final approach to the buildings. They were caught between certain danger and uncertain refuge. Victor squared his shoulders, making his decision. "We go forward," he told Shadow, his voice firm with resolve. "We've come too far to turn back now." With the wolves pacing behind them, Victor led Shadow out of the forest shelter and into the open fields of Montgomery Estate, the place where both their lives had once been defined by service and loyalty. The place where they now sought justice for a betrayal that had nearly cost Shadow his life. "Whatever happens next," Victor said, as the distance to the estate buildings slowly diminished, "we face it together." The vast expanse of open field stretched before them like a frozen sea, each step exposing them further to both the biting wind and the hungry wolves that followed in their wake. Victor led Shadow forward with grim determination, one hand firmly gripping the makeshift halter, the other clutching his staff. Behind them, the wolf pack kept pace, no longer hiding their pursuit, but moving with the confident patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. "Steady, Shadow," Victor murmured, his voice carried away by the wind almost as soon as the words left his lips. "One step at a time." The main house of Montgomery Estate grew larger with each passing minute, its gray stone walls and tall chimneys a stark silhouette against the darkening sky. Victor could make out figures moving in the stable yard, workers completing their evening chores, unaware of the drama unfolding across the field. Would they see? Would they understand what was happening? Or would they simply watch as an old man and a blind horse were brought down by wolves on their master's land? The lead wolf, emboldened by the open terrain, began to close the distance between them. Victor could hear the creature's panting breath, closer than before. Without looking back, he knew the pack was preparing to attack. "Shadow," Victor said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "When I tell you, we run, not before. Trust me." The horse's ears swiveled toward him, blind eyes staring forward with unwavering faith. Victor reached into his pocket and withdrew the flint he had carried throughout their journey. With practiced movements, he struck it against his knife, sending sparks onto the oil-soaked rags wrapped around his staff. The material caught immediately, flaring into a bright torch that pushed back the gathering dusk. The sudden light startled the wolves, causing them to hesitate momentarily. Victor seized the opportunity. "Now, Shadow, run!" Together they surged forward, Victor half running, half stumbling alongside the horse, torch held high. Shadow, despite his blindness, broke into a powerful gallop, instinct and memory guiding him across the familiar terrain of his former home. The years of neglect had not diminished the strength in his powerful legs, the nobility in his bearing. For a moment he was once again the magnificent warhorse that had carried Lord Montgomery with such pride. The wolves gave chase immediately, their hesitation forgotten in the excitement of pursuing fleeing prey. The lead wolf drew closer with each bound, jaws open, eyes fixed on Shadow's hind legs. Victor risked a glance over his shoulder and saw death approaching. In that desperate moment, he made the only choice he could. He dropped back slightly, placing himself between Shadow and the attacking wolf. "Go!" he shouted to Shadow, praying the horse would continue toward the safety of the estate buildings. The lead wolf launched itself at Victor, a gray missile of muscle and fang. Victor swung the burning torch with all his remaining strength, catching the predator mid-leap. There was a yelp of pain as flame met fur, and the wolf tumbled to the side, temporarily thwarted. But the rest of the pack was still coming. Victor scrambled to his feet, preparing to face them, knowing he could not hope to survive, but determined to buy Shadow enough time to reach safety. He never had to make that final stand. A thunder of hooves approached from the direction of the estate. Not just Shadow returning, but a half-dozen mounted riders galloping toward them, shouting and brandishing torches of their own. The stable hands, having spotted the wolves from a distance, had mounted whatever horses were ready and ridden out in response. The wolf pack, confronted with multiple humans on horseback, scattered and retreated toward the forest edge. Only the lead wolf lingered, wounded pride warring with survival instinct, before finally turning to follow his pack into the gathering darkness. Victor stood trembling in the middle of the field, torch still gripped in one hand, the other pressed against his side where pain bloomed sharp and insistent. One of the riders approached, leading Shadow by the makeshift halter. "Master Victor?" the young man asked incredulously, dismounting to approach the old stable master. "Is it really you after all these years?" Victor squinted in the torchlight, recognition dawning slowly. "Thomas? Little Thomas, who couldn't even saddle a pony without help?" The young man smiled, though concern remained evident in his eyes. "Not so little anymore, sir. Head groom now since my father passed." "Your father was a good man," Victor said, wincing as the pain in his side intensified. "He taught you well, I see." "Sir, you're injured," Thomas said, noticing the growing dark stain on Victor's shirt. "And this horse, is this Shadow? We all thought he was put down days ago, on the master's orders." "That's not what Frederick had in mind for him," Victor replied grimly. "Where is he? I need to speak with him." "At the house, sir, but you need tending first. That wolf got you good." Victor waved away the concern, though in truth he felt lightheaded from blood loss and exhaustion. "Shadow first. Make sure he's properly stabled, fed, and watered. Then take me to Frederick." Thomas hesitated, then nodded, issuing quick orders to the other grooms. Two dismounted to help Victor while the others took charge of Shadow, leading him with gentle care toward the stables he had once called home. "Careful with him," Victor called after them. "He's blind, but still proud." The walk to the main house seemed to take an eternity, each step sending fresh waves of pain through Victor's side. By the time they reached the grand entrance, he was leaning heavily on Thomas, his face pale beneath his silver beard. Frederick Montgomery was waiting for them in the study, a glass of brandy in his hand, his expression a mixture of annoyance and surprise at the interruption to his evening. "What's this about wolves on the property?" he demanded, not immediately recognizing the bloodied old man supported by his head groom. Then realization dawned, and his face darkened. "Victor Hartman, I thought you were long dead." "Not yet," Victor replied, straightening despite the pain. "Though not for lack of trying on the part of your wolves." Frederick's gaze narrowed. "My wolves? What nonsense is this?" "The wolves that nearly killed Shadow, the horse you tied to a tree and left as bait," Victor said, his voice gaining strength as righteous anger pushed back against physical weakness. "The horse that served your father faithfully for 15 years. A flash of something, guilt, fear, crossed Frederick's face before his features settled into a cold mask. The horse was blind, useless, a burden on the estate resources. I simply hastened the inevitable." "You sentenced him to a cruel death," Victor countered. "A death unworthy of any horse, let alone one that carried your father into battle and brought him home safely." Frederick turned away, moving to pour another brandy. "What would you have had me do? Waste good feed on a blind animal? My father's sentimentality nearly bankrupted this estate. I make practical decisions." "Practical?" Victor laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call abandoning a faithful servant to be torn apart by wolves? What would your father say if he could see you now?" The mention of Lord Montgomery struck a nerve. Frederick's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles whitened. "My father is dead. This estate is mine to manage as I see fit." "And what of honor? What of the Montgomery name that once stood for fairness and decency?" Victor stepped forward, ignoring the pain that tore at his side. "Your father would be ashamed." Frederick spun around, face flushed with anger. "How dare you speak to me of my father, you who abandoned your post when he needed you most?" "I left because I could not stand by and watch cruelty masked as necessity," Victor replied steadily. "The same cruelty you showed Shadow." A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Outside, the last light of day had faded, leaving the windows dark mirrors that reflected the scene within, an aging stablemaster confronting the lord of the estate over the fate of a single horse. Finally, Frederick spoke, his voice subdued. "What do you want, Victor? Why have you come back after all these years?" "Justice for Shadow," Victor answered simply, "and a reminder of who you were meant to be. Your father's son, a man of honor and compassion." Frederick stared into his brandy for a long moment, then set the glass down untouched. "The horse is blind. What would you have me do with him now?" "Give him to me," Victor said without hesitation. "Let me take him to my cabin. I'll care for him for whatever time he has left." "And why would I do that?" Frederick asked, though the fight had gone out of his voice. Victor met his gaze steadily. "Because deep down, you know it's what your father would have wanted. And because despite everything, you are still William Montgomery's son." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge and a plea wrapped in one. Frederick turned away, moving to the window to stare out at the darkness that had claimed his lands. "Take the horse," he said finally. "Consider it payment for your injury. But don't come back here, Victor. That chapter is closed. Victor nodded, accepting the compromise for what it was. Not true understanding, perhaps, but a small victory for decency. Thank you, my lord. As spring returned to the forest, new life emerged from winter's grip. In a small clearing near Victor's cabin, Shadow grazed contentedly, his blind eyes closed as he enjoyed the warmth of the sun on his back. The old wounds had healed, leaving only faint scars as reminders of his ordeal. His coat, once dull with neglect, now gleamed with health, brushed daily by hands that valued him not for his usefulness but for his spirit. Victor sat on the porch, whittling a piece of pine as he watched over his friend. The wound from the wolf attack had been slow to heal, leaving him with a permanent reminder of their journey together. But like Shadow, he had survived, finding in the aftermath a renewed purpose and an unexpected peace. "We made it, old friend," he called, and Shadow's ears swiveled toward the sound of his voice, a soft nicker of acknowledgement floating back across the clearing. Together, they had faced death and won. Together, they had found home,